I knew something was wrong before I even got the truck all the way up my driveway. My mare, Daisy, was pacing hard enough to kick dust against the corral gate. My old gelding Buck had his ears pinned back, and out past the cottonwoods, where my fence had stood for more than 30 years, there was nothing but a raw brown scar across the land. The fence was gone. Not leaning, not damaged, not knocked loose by storm. Gone. Somebody had pulled every cedar post out of the ground, snapped half the rails, dragged the rest into a pile near my hay shed, and planted a laminated notice in the dirt, like they had just won a war. It said in bold black letters, "Exterior boundary structure fails to meet community appearance standards." I remember staring at that thing for a long time, still holding my truck keys in one hand, wondering if I had somehow driven into the wrong life. Because the little gated subdivision next to my ranch had an HOA, sure, but I did not live in that subdivision. I did not pay their dues. I did not use their clubhouse. I did not vote in their meetings, attend their wine nights, or care what color they wanted people to paint their mailboxes. I lived on 82 acres of land that had been in my family long before Maple Glen Preserve showed up with matching rooftops, fake stone entry signs, and a board of directors who acted like they had been appointed by Congress. But there I was, standing in the late afternoon sun, with my horses getting restless behind me, and a piece of HOA paperwork flapping from a broken post on my side of the property line. I wish I could tell you I marched right over there and made a scene, but I did not at first. I have learned that when somebody does something that reckless, anger is not always the first thing you feel. Sometimes you just go quiet. Sometimes your brain starts collecting details because it knows your heart is not ready to catch up yet. The tire tracks were deep, wider than a pickup, with the tread of a compact bulldozer or skid steer. There were gouges through the pasture grass where they had crossed my land. One of the posts had been ripped out so hard it brought up a chunk of black soil the size of a suitcase. And there was Buck, standing near the open stretch, looking through the missing fence at the neat little trail that ran behind Maple Glen like he could not understand why the world suddenly had no edge. That was the part that got me. My dad built that fence. He put it in back when I was 14, when the land was still mostly scrub pasture and old pecan trees, when we had one tractor that started only if you talked nice to it, and one barn door that never shut straight in the winter. My father was not sentimental about much. He did not frame pictures. He did not make speeches. But he believed in doing a job once and doing it right, and those cedar posts had been sunk deep enough to outlive both of us. The fence was not fancy. It was weathered and crooked in a couple spots, dark from rain and sun and years of horses rubbing their necks against it, but it held. It told a world where our place ended. My dad used to say, a fence did not have to be pretty, to be honest. It just had to stand where it belonged. I had not thought about that line in years. Then I saw those posts lying in a pile like firewood. Maple Glen Preserve had been built about 4 years earlier, just beyond the south field. At first, I did not have much of a problem with it. The developer bought the old McKinley orchard, tore down a few dead sheds, planted ornamental pear trees along the road, and started putting up houses so close together you could probably borrow sugar through the bathroom window. I figured they had their life and I had mine. Most people kept to themselves. A few joggers used the walking path along the edge of their property and would wave when they passed my fence. There was a retired couple named Frank and Louise who always brought apples for Buck, and a girl with freckles who used to stop and ask me about the horses whenever her mother let her. So no, it was not everybody over there. That is important. It never is everybody. But all it takes is one person with a title, a clipboard, and an unhealthy relationship with control to make a whole neighborhood miserable. In Maple Glen, that person was Marjorie Vale. Marjorie was the HOA president, and I swear she dressed for every conversation like she was about to give a press conference. Even on a Tuesday morning, she would show up in bright blouses, clean white sneakers, sunglasses big enough to land a helicopter on, and that smile some people have when they are already enjoying an argument they have not started yet. The first letter she sent about my fence came in a cream envelope with the Maple Glen crest stamped on the front. I opened it at my kitchen table while Buck was making noise outside because he thought breakfast was late. The letter said my fence created a visual inconsistency along the community wellness trail, and that it negatively impacted the carefully managed appearance of the development. I read it twice, then I put it down and laughed so hard I nearly spilled coffee on it. Buck snorted from the window, and I told him, "Well, buddy, apparently your fence is hurting somebody's feelings." I ignored that letter because I assumed common sense still existed somewhere in the county. A month later, another one came. This time, it claimed the fence might create a safety concern for residents using the trail. That was impressive, considering the fence had been standing there for decades without once attacking a jogger. I threw that one in the trash too. Then one Saturday morning, Marjorie came to the property line herself. I was fixing a loose hinge on the barn door when I heard heels clicking across the gravel near the trail. I turned around, and there she was, holding a clipboard against her chest like a shield. She smiled at me. Not warmly, more like the way a dentist smiles before telling you something is going to hurt. She said, "Mr. Rourke, I was hoping we could finally discuss that fence." I looked over at it, then back at her. "You mean the one standing on my land?" She let out a little breath through her nose. "I mean the one affecting our community environment." I wiped my hands on my jeans and said, "Marjorie, I do not know how they do things inside those gates, but this is not your community. This is my ranch." She nodded slowly, like I had said something cute. Then she started talking about cohesion, property values, neighborhood standards, and how residents had expressed concern that the fence made the trail feel less polished. Less polished, that was the phrase she used, as if my land existed to provide scenery for people in running shoes. I told her the fence was staying. I told her she had no authority over it, and I told her to keep herself and her paperwork on her side of the line. She stood there for a second with that plastic smile frozen on her face, then said, "We will see what options are available to us." At the time, I figured that meant more letters, maybe a complaint to the county, maybe some petty nonsense involving a surveyor. I did not think it meant they would hire a crew, drive across my pasture, and tear down something they did not own. But I should have known better. The week before the fence disappeared, I noticed fresh tracks along the edge of the south field. Heavy tracks. I crouched down, pressed my fingers into the soil, and felt how soft the dirt still was. Somebody had been there recently. I walked the property line, but the fence was intact then. I told myself it was probably a landscaping company that missed a turn. Maple Glen was always having something trimmed, sprayed, paved, repainted, power washed, or emotionally managed. I tried not to think about it. Then came that Thursday afternoon. I had spent the day in town picking up feed, hardware, and a replacement part for my water pump. I was tired, hot, and ready to get home. The sun was dropping low behind the rooftops when I turned in off County Road 6, and that was when I saw the open stretch where the fence used to be. I got out of the truck, walked over to the notice, and pulled it from the ground. The back had the Maple Glen HOA letterhead. There was a signature at the bottom, Marjorie Vale. That was when the shock finally burned off, and something colder took its place. I stood there in the dirt, reading that notice while the wind pushed at it in my hand, and I thought about every time she had stood on the other side of that fence talking about harmony. Every time she had looked at my place like it was a flaw in the view. Every time she had treated my land like an inconvenience she could eventually manage away, and I realized something about people like Marjorie. They do not believe in boundaries unless they drew them. They do not believe in rights unless those rights belong to them. And they do not understand consequences until the consequences walk straight through their front gate wearing muddy boots. The next morning, I followed the tracks. I fed the horses early, checked the corral twice, then climbed into my truck and traced those ruts out of the pasture, down the service road and toward an equipment yard about a mile from town. The place belonged to a local contractor called Dawson Earthworks. They handled landscaping, drainage, grading, small demolition jobs, that kind of thing. When I pulled in, I saw 3 skid steers, a flatbed trailer, a stack of pallets, and a yellow bulldozer parked off to one side with dry black mud still clinging to its tracks. A man in a reflective vest was leaning over the hood of a pickup, filling out forms. He looked up when I walked over. He was maybe 50, broad shoulders, sunburned neck, the kind of guy who had spent his whole life working outdoors and did not enjoy surprises before 10 in the morning. He said, "Can I help you?" I said, "I own the ranch next to Maple Glen Preserve." His face changed just a little. It was not fear, not yet. More like recognition arriving late. I pointed at the bulldozer. "Did that machine tear down a fence yesterday?" He looked at the dozer, then back at me. "Depends what fence. The cedar rail fence along the south side of my land, the one your crew crossed private property to remove." He shifted his weight, "Look, if there is a problem, you need to take it up with the client." I said, "I am trying to figure out who told you to trespass." He sighed. "That HOA board hired us. They said there was a non-compliant boundary fence on the trail line. We were told it needed to come down." I stared at him. "Did anybody tell you it was not part of their property?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "No. We got a map, a work order, and a check. We do what the client asks." I looked over at the machine again. There was still dirt from my land packed under the metal track. I could smell the pasture soil in it, dark and damp, the same soil my father had worked, the same soil I had worked most of my life. I said, "You ever think about checking whether the thing you are tearing down belongs to the person paying you?" He did not answer. A couple workers nearby had stopped moving and were pretending to be busy with straps and tools. The foreman finally said, "Sir, if it was a mix-up, I am sorry, a mix-up." That was a good one. I nodded slowly and said, "I appreciate you being honest." Then I turned around and walked back to my truck. The foreman probably thought the conversation was over. In one way it was. I had what I needed. I had confirmation. I had a signature. I had tracks, damage, a destroyed fence, a contractor who admitted who hired him, and a woman in a bright blouse who had spent months acting like my property was a problem she had the right to solve. On the drive home, I did not feel angry anymore. I felt clear, and clarity can be a dangerous thing when somebody has spent too long mistaking your patience for weakness. I passed the entrance to Maple Glen on my way back. The stone sign was surrounded by flowers, their fountain was running, and the little banner near the gate said, "Welcome home to elevated living." I remember looking at it and thinking, you have no idea what home means. At the far end of my property, tucked behind a row of cottonwoods, stood the old pump house my father built when I was a kid. It was nothing special to look at, just a squat metal building with rust around the hinges and a gravel path leading to the door. Most people in Maple Glen did not even know it was there. The developer knew. The original board knew. And somewhere underneath all their paperwork and rules and designer landscaping, the HOA had forgotten a fact that should have mattered more than any fence. Their clubhouse pool, their sprinkler system, their little community kitchen, and half the water pressure feeding their amenities came through a line connected to that pump house. My father had agreed to it years ago, back when the development was still just a sales office and a few stakes in the ground. The developer told him city water would reach the neighborhood within 18 months. They asked if they could use our well temporarily. My father, being my father, agreed with a handshake. In exchange, we got access to their paved service road, which saved us 10 minutes every time we hauled feed into town. It was supposed to be temporary, but temporary has a funny way of becoming permanent when nobody bothers to question something that is working for them. City water never came. The HOA kept using the well. My father passed away. I took over the ranch. And because the arrangement had never caused trouble, I left it alone. I never billed them, never threatened them, never even brought it up, until Marjorie Vale decided my fence was an eyesore worth destroying. I pulled up beside the pump house and sat in the truck for a minute, hands resting on the steering wheel. I could hear Buck somewhere behind me snorting at a fly. The wind moved through the grass. The world looked exactly the same as it had the day before, but it did not feel the same. I walked to the pump house, put my hand on the old metal door, and remembered my father standing beside me when I was young. He had shown me every valve, every pipe, every pressure gauge. He said, "This thing gives people water, son. Treat it with respect." I stood there a long time, thinking about that. Then I thought about the empty line where my fence had been. I thought about Daisy pacing in the corral. I thought about that laminated notice flapping in the dirt like somebody had claimed victory over my own land. And for the first time since I'd found the fence gone, I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge. At least, not the kind that makes you feel good for 5 minutes and worse for 5 years. I smiled because I finally understood what Marjorie had never understood. Respect was not something you could demand from a distance. It was something you earned, one boundary at a time. I opened the pump house door, stepped inside, and listened to the steady hum of water moving through pipes that had been forgotten by everyone except me. Then I reached for the main valve that fed Maple Glen Preserve, rested my hand on the wheel, and took one slow breath. Then I turned it. Not fast, not dramatic, just one steady pull of my hand until the old metal wheel gave way with a hard little groan, and the water rushing through the line began to fade. There was no explosion, no warning siren, no lightning spitting the sky over Maple Glen Preserve. Just a change in the sound inside that pump house. A low hum becoming a softer hum, then almost nothing at all. I stood there with my hand still on the valve, listening to the pipe settle, and for a second I wondered whether my dad would have been disappointed in me. He had always believed in helping neighbors. He believed a handshake meant something. But then I thought about the fact that neighbors do not bring bulldozers onto your land. Neighbors do not tear down something your father built and leave a plastic notice in the dirt like they just corrected a decorating mistake. So I locked the pump house, walked back outside, and let the door close behind me. By the time I got to the house, the sun was high over the pasture. Daisy had calmed down some, Buck was busy with his hay, and the broken rails were still stacked near the shed where the contractor had left them. I spent the next few hours doing ordinary things, which may sound strange considering what I had just done. I repaired a latch on the barn, checked the water troughs, moved a few feed bags into the shed, and picked up pieces of my old fence one at a time. I was not trying to make a point for anybody watching. I just needed my hands busy. There is something about fixing one small thing when another part of your life has been torn apart that keeps you from losing your head. Around sunset, I took a beer out to the porch and sat in the same chair my father used to sit in after a long day. From there, if you looked past the south field and through the trees, you could see part of Maple Glen's clubhouse roof and the bright blue rectangle of their pool. At least it had been bright blue that morning. By sunset, the water did not look right. Even from that distance, I could tell the surface had lost that clean, glassy shimmer. The pool filters had stopped circulating. The fountain near the patio was dry. A few people were gathered around the clubhouse, pointing at things, walking fast, looking in that confused way people do when something they assumed would always work suddenly does not. I took a sip of beer and said quietly, "Well, Marjorie, looks like we both have a maintenance issue." The next morning, I woke up before dawn and went outside with my coffee. The pasture was wet with dew, the air had that cool early spring bite to it, and for a few minutes everything felt normal again. Then I heard shouting from the direction of Maple Glen. Not close enough to make out words, but close enough to recognize the sound of people whose plans had come apart before breakfast. I did not need binoculars. I knew exactly what was happening. Their pool system depended on a steady water supply. Without it, the filters could not keep pressure, the circulation pumps would shut down, and the chemical balance would go sideways in a hurry. By noon, the pool would start turning cloudy. By the next day, it would have that dull, green edge that makes every parent suddenly remember they have an appointment somewhere else. I wish I could say I felt guilty, but guilt was not really the feeling. It was more like relief, not because their pool was failing, but because for once the imbalance had stopped being mine alone to carry. Around 8 that morning, a man I had never seen before came marching up my driveway holding a red binder under one arm. He was wearing khaki shorts, a golf shirt, and the expression of somebody who had been sent into a conversation he did not want to have. He stopped about 10 feet from my porch and called out, "Are you Mr. Rourke?" I looked over the rim of my coffee cup and said, "Depends who is asking." He blinked, then straightened himself. "My name is Dennis Corbett. I'm on the Maple Glen board. We are investigating a major water systems issue at the clubhouse." I said, "That sounds serious." He opened the binder and flipped through a few pages, trying hard to make himself look official. "We have reason to believe the disruption may be connected to some recent conflict involving the HOA. I set my coffee down. Recent conflict. You mean when your president hired a crew to tear down my fence? He looked uncomfortable right away. "I'm not here to discuss that." "Of course you are not," I said. "You are here because your pool is turning into a soup bowl, and somebody finally realized the problem might not be inside your gate." His face tightened. "Mr. Rourke, I need to ask you directly whether you know anything about the water supply interruption." I leaned back in my chair and looked out over the field. Then I said, "Dennis, I have not touched 1 inch of Maple Glen property. I have not crossed your gate, I have not gone near your clubhouse, and I have not tampered with anything that belongs to your HOA. He stared at me for a second. "And what are you saying?" I picked up my coffee again. "I am saying maybe you should ask Marjorie what she knows about my property." Dennis looked like he wanted to say something sharp, but he could not find the words. Finally, he shut the binder, turned around, and walked back down my driveway. His shoulders were stiff by the time he reached his SUV. That was the first visitor. It was not the last. By lunchtime, the Maple Glen Facebook page had apparently become a full-blown disaster zone. I only knew because one of the residents, a woman named Tessa, who had always been decent to me, texted me a screenshot. Somebody had forgotten to make the group private, and every complaint in that neighborhood was suddenly visible to the world. Why is the pool closed? Why are we paying dues if the clubhouse is unusable? My son's birthday party was supposed to be Saturday. Somebody needs to resign. Marjorie needs to fix this. There were arguments about pipes, arguments about money, arguments about whether the water smelled bad, and one woman who seemed personally offended that algae could exist near her children. Tessa had added one message beneath the screenshot. Thought you might enjoy this. I texted back, I'm trying to be a better person. She replied, do not try too hard. By the second day, the pool looked terrible. I could see it through the gap where my fence used to be, and I will admit there was something almost poetic about it. The water had gone from blue to grayish-green. The fountain was silent. The patio furniture was stacked against one wall, and the yellow caution sign had been hung near the entrance. A group of kids had gathered outside the pool fence, probably hoping for some excitement, and I watched one little boy point toward the water while his mother pulled him away. A couple of adults were standing nearby with their arms crossed, staring at the pool like it had personally betrayed them. By that evening, I could smell it from the trail. Not enough to knock you over, but enough to remind you that nature is always waiting right behind the fence line, ready to take back anything people neglect. Then Marjorie came to my driveway. I saw her white SUV before I saw her. It rolled in too fast, throwing dust behind it, then stopped hard near my gate. She got out wearing a pale blue blazer, sunglasses, and the same expression she had worn every time she tried to tell me what to do with my own land. But something was different now. Her lipstick was perfect, her hair was perfect, her posture was perfect, but the confidence underneath it had started to crack. She walked toward me while I was unloading feed from the truck. She did not say hello. She said, "What did you do?" I kept lifting bags like I had not heard her. She repeated it, louder this time. "What did you do to our water supply?" I set the bag down carefully, wiped my hands on my jeans, and looked at her. I said, "You are going to have to be more specific, Marjorie. You have done quite a bit to my property lately." Her jaw tightened. "Do not play games with me. The clubhouse is without water pressure, the pool system is failing, residents are furious, and I have a county inspector threatening to shut us down." I nodded slowly. "That sounds like a lot of responsibility for one person." She took a step closer. "You shut off the water." "I did not touch your water," I said. "I stopped providing access to mine." Her face went still. For the first time since I had met her, Marjorie Vale looked genuinely confused. Then realization started moving across her face, slow and ugly. "The well," she said. "I said nothing." "The old well," she said. "I said nothing. The old well." "My father had an arrangement with the developer," she said, half to herself now. "A temporary arrangement," I told her. Temporary. That was the word your people used for over a decade. She looked past me toward the pump house through the trees, and I could see the math happening behind her eyes. Their clubhouse, their pool, their sprinkler system, their weekend events, their perfect little image of elevated living, all of it was tied to a metal building on land she had treated like a nuisance. Marjorie turned back to me. "You cannot just cut us off." I lit the empty stretch where my fence had been. Then I said, "That is interesting. I thought you believed you could just remove things from other people's property whenever they offended your sense of style." Her face reddened. "That fence was a safety concern." I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "A safety concern. My horses had an open path toward your trail because your crew ripped out the barrier, keeping them contained. You sent heavy equipment across my pasture. You destroyed private property. You left an HOA violation notice on land you do not own. And now you want to talk to me about safety." She pointed a finger at me. "This is sabotage." "No," I said, stepping closer just enough that she had to look up at me. "Sabotage is sneaking onto somebody else's land and tearing down what belongs to them. What I did is called ending a favor." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For a moment, we just stood there in the dust, with the broken fence behind me and the silent pump house off in the trees. Then she tried one last time to sound like the person in charge. "You need to restore access immediately." I looked at her and said, "You need to rebuild my fence immediately. You need to repair my land. You need to explain why your board thought it had authority over property outside your community. And after that, maybe we can have a conversation about what my water is worth." Her sunglasses did not hide the shock in her eyes. She turned around without another word, got into her SUV, and backed out so fast she nearly clicked my gatepost. I watched her leave, then looked over at Buck, who had wandered close enough to see what all the fuss was about. He gave a soft snort. I rubbed his neck and said, "I know, buddy. She is not going to like this part." By dark, the cars started arriving. First came Dennis with the red binder. Then two board members I recognized from neighborhood meetings I had never attended but somehow always heard about. Then the clubhouse manager, a nervous little man named Howard with a tie that looked too tight around his neck. Finally, Marjorie came back, this time with no sunglasses and no smile. They stood at the end of my driveway like a group of people waiting outside a principal's office. I walked out onto the porch and let them stand there for a minute. Nobody spoke at first. Then Howard cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Rourke, we need the water restored." I said, "I am sure you do." He looked down at a folder in his hands. "The pool filtration equipment has failed. We are losing scheduled events. The water quality is deteriorating. Parents are complaining. The county health office has been notified." "That is unfortunate," I said. Marjorie took a breath through her nose. "We are willing to discuss compensation for the fence." Compensation. I repeated the words slowly. That is a better start than community appearance standards. Dennis handed me a folder. Inside was a preliminary estimate from their insurance company. It covered some lumber, a little labor, and a number so low I almost thought it was a joke. I looked at it, then looked at them. I said, "You had a bulldozer cross my pasture. You destroyed a fence built by my father. You put my livestock at risk. You trespassed. And you have been using water from my land for years without a contract, without payment, and apparently without even remembering whose property the well was on." I handed the paper back. "This does not begin to cover it." Marjorie said, "We had no idea the well was still legally yours." I said, "That is not a defense. That is a confession." The group went quiet. Then I walked inside, came back out with a folder of my own and handed it to Dennis. He opened it. The first page was an itemized invoice. Replacement fence materials. Labor. Soil restoration. Livestock safety measures. Labor. Soil restoration. Livestock safety measures. Property damage. Trespass damages. Then, at the bottom, a separate line for unpaid water usage based on a reasonable local commercial rate for the years Maple Glen had been connected to my system. Dennis read it once. Then he read it again. Howard leaned over his shoulder. Marjorie did not move. Finally, Dennis looked up and said, "This is a lot of money." I said, "So is a private water supply." Marjorie crossed her arms. "You are trying to extort us." I shook my head. "No, Marjorie. Extortion is when somebody takes something that does not belong to them and demands payment to return it. I am asking you to pay for what you destroyed and for what you have been using. The difference matters." She looked like she wanted to argue, but the others were no longer looking at me. They were looking at her. And for the first time I saw something in that group that I had not seen before. Doubt. Not doubt about whether I was serious. They knew I was serious. Doubt about whether Marjorie had led them into a disaster they could not talk their way out of. Dennis closed the folder and said quietly, "We will need to take this to the board." I nodded. "Take your time. The pool will still be there tomorrow. Probably greener, but it will be there." Howard looked like he might be sick. Marjorie did not say another word. They all got back into their cars and left in a line, their headlights bouncing down my gravel driveway as the night settled over the pasture. I stayed on the porch long after they were gone. The air smelled like dust and wet grass. Somewhere down by the trees, the pump house sat silent, holding the line exactly where it belonged. And across the field, behind the gates of Maple Glen Preserve, a neighborhood built on control was beginning to understand what it felt like when control was no longer theirs. The next morning, I expected another threat, another letter, maybe a lawyer trying to explain why a fence on my land had somehow become a community concern. But what I got was silence. The kind of silence that comes after people spend a whole night realizing they may have backed the wrong person. I was out by the south field before sunrise walking the torn-up line where the fence used to stand, when I noticed a few cars parked along the Maple Glen Trail. Nobody got out. They just sat there for a while, staring across the open stretch of pasture, probably seeing the damage clearly for the first time without Marjorie standing nearby to explain why it was all necessary. In daylight, there was no way to dress it up. The grass had been carved apart by machine tracks, the posts were shattered, and the rails my father had put in by hand were stacked in a crooked pile near the shed. It did not look like maintenance. It looked like somebody had driven onto another man's land and tried to erase a boundary because they did not like looking at it. I spent most of that morning cleaning up the broken wood. I was not doing it because I had forgiven anyone, and I was not doing it because I thought the old rails could be saved. Most of them could not. I did it because I needed to reclaim the space a little at a time. Every rail I picked up felt like I was taking back one piece of the day they had tried to make me feel powerless. Buck followed me along the corral fence, curious as always, and Daisy stood near the open side of the pasture, watching the trail with the kind of suspicion horses reserve for things that do not belong. Around 10, my phone started buzzing. First it was Tessa, then Frank, then somebody I did not know from Maple Glen. Apparently, a resident had taken photos of the damage and posted them in the community group, along with a picture of Marjorie's violation notice sitting in the dirt. That was all it took. The conversation changed fast. People who had spent months complaining that my fence was ugly were suddenly asking why the board had touched property outside the HOA. People who had never cared where their pool water came from were asking why the board had no contract, no easement, no payment history, and no explanation. Somebody posted that they had looked through old meeting notes and found references to a temporary water arrangement from before most of the homes were built. Somebody else posted the contractor invoice, which proved Marjorie had personally approved the removal job. By lunchtime, the neighborhood had stopped arguing about algae and started arguing about her. There is a special kind of panic that spreads through a community when people realize the person they trusted to protect their property values might be the same person who just created a legal disaster big enough to lower every one of them. That afternoon, a county health inspector came out to Maple Glen. I watched from the edge of my field while he walked around the clubhouse pool with a clipboard, tested the water, spoke with Howard, then spoke with Marjorie. Even from a distance, I could tell it was not going well. Marjorie had one hand on her hip and the other waving around like she could somehow manage the situation into behaving. The inspector did not look impressed. He walked the length of the pool, looked at the cloudy water, checked the dead filters, then put up a notice that could be seen from the trail. Pool closed until further notice. By evening, that sign had become the least of their problems. I was sitting on the porch with a glass of sweet tea when a grey pickup came slowly up my driveway. It was not one of the bored SUVs. It was older, dusty around the wheel wells, and it stopped with the kind of careful hesitation that told me whoever was inside did not want to make things worse. The driver stepped out and I recognized him right away. His name was Walter Grady. He had been on the Maple Glen board for years, though I had only spoken to him once before at the hardware store. Walter was the quiet kind, always in a worn bull cap, always looking like he would rather be fishing than sitting through a meeting about hedge height. He carried a plain brown envelope in one hand, no binder, no clipboard, no performance. He walked toward the porch and said, "Evening, Cole." I said, "Evening, Walter." He looked past me at the broken fence line, then shook his head slowly. That should never have happened. I did not answer right away. Sometimes an apology is worth more when you let it sit in the air for a second. He stepped closer and said, "I am not here to defend Marjorie. I am not here to make excuses. The board met last night. Nobody knew she had hired the contractor until after your water was shut off and the pool stopped working." I gave him a look. "You expect me to believe she acted alone?" Walter sighed. "I expect you to believe we were stupid enough to let her act like she ran the place without asking enough questions. That was honest, at least." I motioned toward the empty chair beside me. He sat down, held the envelope in both hands for a moment, then said, "The residents are furious. Half the board wants her gone. The other half wants to pretend this can all be fixed with a public statement and a new landscaping budget." I said, "Let me guess which half she is in." Walter almost smiled. "You would be surprised how quickly people find courage once the pool starts smelling like a swamp and the county starts calling." I let out a short laugh. That was the first thing that had made me laugh all day. He opened the envelope and pulled out a few papers. They were not a final agreement, just a proposal, but it was more serious than anything I'd seen from them yet. They offered to pay for the full fence replacement, soil repair, and a new gate. They offered to cover the contractor damages, and they wanted to talk about a formal long-term lease for the well. Walter looked at me carefully. He said, We cannot keep relying on a handshake agreement. Not after this, I said. You should not have relied on it before this. He nodded. I know. My father used to say a good neighbor does not need paperwork to do the right thing. But I learned something after he died. A handshake is only as good as the person standing across from you. When that person changes, or forgets, or decides your land is just part of their view, the handshake is all you have left. Walter stared out over the field. Then he said, I read the old records. Your father helped us when he did not have to. Our developer benefited from that arrangement for years. The board benefited from it. Residents benefited from it. And nobody ever bothered to ask whether you were being treated fairly. I looked at him. You are the first person from that neighborhood who has said that to me. He nodded once. Then let me be the first person to say we need to fix it. I took the papers from him, flipped through them, and saw the numbers. They were better than Marjorie's offer, but not enough. There was no mention of the years of free water use, no mention of a permanent written easement, no mention of my approval over the fence design. They wanted peace, but they still wanted it on terms they could control. I handed the papers back. I said, Walter, you are headed in the right direction, but you are not there yet. He looked tired, not offended. What would get us there? I stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, and looked toward the pump house through the trees. Then I turned back to him. Full repayment for the fence, the land damage, and the contractor mess. A 20-year lease on the well, paid up front to the first 5 years, with a rate adjustment written into the contract. An easement that does not let anyone enter my property without my written permission. My right to inspect the line whenever I want. And the fence gets rebuilt exactly where it stood, with a design approved by me, not your board. Walter did not interrupt. I continued. And there is one more thing. No HOA notice, no letter, no board member, no contractor. Nobody sets foot on my land again without my permission. Ever. He looked down at the papers in his hands. Then he said, I cannot promise every part of that tonight. But I can tell you I will take it to the board exactly as you said it. I nodded. Good, because the valve stays closed until it is in writing. Walter stood up slowly. Before we walked back to his truck, he looked over at the broken fence again and said, For what it is worth, Cole, I am sorry. Not as a board member, just as a neighbor. I watched him drive away, and for the first time since the fence came down, I felt something shift. Not trust. I was nowhere near trust, but maybe there was a path back to something close to respect. Over the next 2 days, Maple Glen became a pressure cooker. The pool got worse. The water turned from cloudy green to something closer to pond water, and the smell reached the walking trail on warm afternoons. Somebody told me there was even a turtle in it one morning, just floating around like he had paid the HOA dues himself. That story made its way through the neighborhood faster than anything else. Kids thought it was funny. Adults did not. The HOA tried bringing in water trucks, but without the filtration system running properly, they were basically pouring clean water into a problem that was already alive and growing. The county inspector came back. Another notice went up. The clubhouse cancelled events. A birthday party got moved. A bridal shower got postponed. Parents were mad. Retirees were mad. Golfers were mad. And people who had never attended an HOA meeting in their lives were suddenly demanding copies of every budget document from the last 5 years. By the third night, the whole place looked less like a polished community and more like a town hall waiting for somebody to confess. Then, just after dark, I saw headlights coming down my driveway again. This time there were 3 SUVs. Walter was in the front. Dennis was behind him. And in the third vehicle was Marjorie. I could see her through the windshield before she even got out. No bright blazer, no white sneakers, just jeans, a dark shirt, and a face that looked like she had not slept much. They all walked toward the porch together. I came outside and stood at the top of the steps. Nobody spoke for a moment. The crickets were loud in the field. The air was warm. Somewhere behind me, Buck shifted in his stall. Walter stepped forward first. He held a thick folder in both hands. He said, The board met for 6 hours. I said, That sounds exhausting. Dennis gave a tired little laugh, then looked embarrassed that he had. Walter continued, Marjorie has resigned as HOA president, effective immediately. Marjorie looked at the ground. I did not feel happy about it, not the way I thought I might. Watching somebody lose their pride is not as satisfying when you can see how much damage it has done to everybody around them. But consequences are still consequences, and some people only learn that after they have taken the whole room down with them. Walter handed me the folder. Inside was everything I had asked for: a formal lease agreement for the well, 20 years, with the first 5 years paid in advance, scheduled rate increases, clear access rules, liability protections, a written acknowledgement that the HOA had no authority over my land, full reimbursement for the fence, the soil repairs, the contractor damage, and the emergency livestock fencing I had put up to keep Daisy and Buck safe. There was also a cashier's check attached to the agreement, and I will be honest, I had to read the number twice. It was enough to rebuild the fence right, repair the land, upgrade the old pump house, and put away something for the future. I looked through every page slowly. They stood there and waited. When I reached the final section, I saw the fence clause: cedar rails, same property line, 4-rail construction, new posts sunk up deeper than before, final approval reserved for me. I looked up at Walter. He said, "We will have a professional crew out here by Monday. A different crew, one that knows how to read a survey." I nodded once. That sounds like a good place to start. Then Marjorie stepped forward. She looked nothing like the woman who had stood in my driveway a few days earlier, demanding I restore access immediately. Her shoulders had dropped. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet. She said, "I was wrong. I waited." She took a breath. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. I thought the fence was hurting property values. I thought I had the right to act because it affected our trail." I said, "You did not think you had the right, Marjorie. You thought you would never be challenged." Her face tightened, but she nodded. "That is fair." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "The worst part is, you never once came to talk to me like a neighbor. You came with letters. You came with threats. You came with a crew. If you had asked, I might have told you the fence was old and I had already been thinking about repairing sections of it. I might have let you plant trees on your side of the trail. We could have found a way to make it better for everyone. But you wanted control, not a solution." She looked down. "I know. I wish I could take it back." I said, "You cannot take it back. You can only make sure you never do it to somebody else." There was a long silence after that. Then Walter said, "So, do we have an agreement?" I closed the folder. I looked toward the field where the old fence had stood, then toward the pump house beyond the trees. I said, "We have an agreement when that contract clears, the payment clears, and the new fence is standing where the old one stood." Walter nodded. "Fair enough." They left a few minutes later. Marjorie was the last one to get into her SUV. Before she shut the door, she looked back at the broken fence line one more time. Maybe, for the first time, she finally saw it for what it was. Not a flaw in the view, not an inconvenience, a boundary. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of trucks. Not bulldozers, not machines cutting through the pasture like they owned it. These were smaller work trucks with the local fencing company logo on the doors. The foreman got out, walked straight to my porch, took off his cap, and introduced himself as Eli Mercer. He said, "Mr. Mumble, Raw, I have the plans from the HOA, but I was told you are the one approving the job." I looked at him for a second, then said, "That is the first smart thing I have heard from that neighborhood all week." He laughed, and right there I knew he was going to be easier to work with. Eli did not assume, he asked. He measured the old line, checked the torn ground, marked every post location, and walked the whole boundary with me before anybody unloaded a single piece of lumber. We chose cedar, 4 rails, heavier posts, a stronger gate near the corral. He even suggested reinforcing the lower section so Buck could not lean against it and work it loose whenever he got bored, which happened more often than I cared to admit. For the next week, I watched that fence come back to life, one post at a time. The sound of the post driver hitting the earth became part of my mornings. Thud, 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 straight lines rising out of soil that had been torn apart. There was something healing in it, not because a new fence erased what happened, but because it proved the damage did not get the last word. Neighbors from Maple Glen started stopping along the trail. Some kept their distance. Some gave awkward waves. A few came right up to the property line and apologized. Frank and Louise brought over a pie one afternoon, which was probably the most honest form of diplomacy available in our county. Tessa showed up with her daughter, who stood staring at the new posts for a while before saying, "It looks prettier now." Her mother looked embarrassed and said, "She means stronger." I smiled and said, "It can be both." Even Dennis came by one day without the red binder. He stood near the gate and said, "For what it is worth, I was wrong too. I should have asked more questions before I showed up here acting like this was your fault." I told him, "Dennis, you were doing what most people do. You trusted the person with the title. Next time, ask who gave them the title and what they are doing with it." He nodded, like that one was going to stick. By the time the new fence was finished, Maple Glen had changed in ways I did not expect. The pool was still closed, drained down to bare concrete while crews worked to clean it, repair the filters, and replace what had failed. The neighborhood was dealing with higher dues, special assessments, insurance calls, angry meetings, and a new acting board president who seemed terrified of making any decision without reading it 3 times first. I heard they changed their rules. No unilateral orders. No contract to work without a full board vote. No contact with non-member property owners without legal review. No letters sent outside the community boundaries. It was amazing what common sense could accomplish once enough people had paid for the alternative. The day the first payment cleared, I walked down to the pump house with the signed contract in my back pocket. Buck followed me halfway, then wandered off to investigate something in the grass. Daisy stayed by the corral, watching me like she knew the routine had changed. I opened the metal door, stepped inside, and stood in front of the valve for a while, the same valve I had turned shut when everything felt raw and unfair. I ran my hand over the old pipe, feeling the cool metal under my palm. I thought about my father. I thought about what he would say if he could see the new fence, the signed contract, the check, and all the mess that had come from one woman deciding she had authority over more than she did. I think he would have been sad that it came to this. But I also think he would have understood. He had taught me to be generous. He had never taught me to be a doormat. So I opened the valve. The wheel turned slowly, the pipes shuddered, and the water began moving again with a deep, steady hum. Somewhere across the field, Maple Glen's system came back to life. Their sprinkler pressure returned. The clubhouse taps ran. Eventually, after enough repairs and enough inspections, their pool would be blue again. But it would never be the same blue it had been before, because now everybody over there knew exactly where that water came from. A month later, I was sitting on my porch at sunset, looking across the pasture at the new fence. It stood straight and strong, catching the last orange light of the day. Buck was grazing near the corral. Daisy had her head down in the grass. The air was quiet in the good way again, not empty, not tense, just settled. I could hear the faint hum of the pump house in the distance, and beyond that, somewhere near the clubhouse, children laughing as the pool reopened for the first time since the whole mess began. I did not resent the sound. That surprised me. Maybe I had gotten what I needed. Not revenge. Not an apology written on fancy paper. Just the simple understanding that my land was mine, my boundaries mattered, and nobody got to treat kindness like weakness without eventually learning what it cost. Still, every now and then, I think about Marjorie standing in my driveway that first day, telling me my fence was an eyesore, like she had the right to judge anything she could see. I wonder whether she understood the real lesson. Because the truth is, the fence was never the problem. The problem was that she believed control could replace respect. She believed a title could turn another person's land into her business. And maybe that is what happens in a lot of neighborhoods, not just mine. People start confusing a rulebook with morality. They start thinking order means ownership. They forget that a community is not a place where the loudest person gets their way. It is a place where people learn to live beside each other without trying to own each other. So tell me what you think. Was I right to shut off access to my well until they made things right? Or did I take it too far when I let their pool fail? Would you have gone straight to court? Or would you have done exactly what I did and made them feel the consequences of crossing a line they never should have touched? Drop your opinion in the comments, because I have a feeling this one is going to divide people. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA, a neighbor, or anybody who thought they had the right to bulldoze over your boundaries, share your story too. Hit like, subscribe, and stay close, because around here, the quietest places usually have the wildest stories.